Marie Antoinette's final words were, "Protect my son." But it was already too late for 7-year-old Louis XVII. The revolutionaries inflicted such horrific tortures on the little prince that modern historians dare not write these details. What happened in the basement of the Temple Tower represents the ultimate peak of human cruelty. Before telling the story, we must accept one truth. In history's darkest pages, there are moments when innocent children fall victim to political games. But what happened in France in 1795 is perhaps the most merciless example of such tragedies. The story I'm about to tell you isn't just about a child's death, but also proof of how barbaric a civilization can become. You find yourself standing in the damp corridors of the Temple Tower on a cold February morning in 1795. The stone walls around you seem to whisper tales of suffering that have echoed through these chambers for years. As you descend the narrow staircase, your footsteps create hollow sounds that bounce off the ancient stones. The air grows thicker with each step, heavy with the scent of mold, despair, and something else you can't quite identify, but that makes your stomach turn. At the bottom of these stairs lies a small, windowless room where the most powerful empire in Europe has chosen to imprison its future king. But this isn't just any prisoner. This is a 10-year-old child whose only crime was being born into the wrong family at the wrong time. The boy you see huddled in the corner bears little resemblance to the golden-haired prince who once ran through the gardens of Versailles. His hair, once carefully groomed by the finest servants in France, now hangs in matted clumps around his gaunt face. His clothes, if they can still be called that, are nothing more than rags that barely cover his emaciated frame. But it's his eyes that truly shock you. Where once sparkled the innocent joy of childhood, now there's only a hollow emptiness that seems to stare through you into some distant horror that only he can see. Born in 1785, Louis Charles was Versailles Palace's beloved darling. The little dauphin slept in golden cradles, wore silk garments, and received France's finest education. Marie Antoinette never hid her love for her son. Palace witnesses wrote that those who saw the queen's happiness while carrying Louis Charles in her arms would find their eyes filling with tears. The small prince had learned to play violin at age 4. He spoke French, German, and Italian. When he ran through Versailles Gardens, his golden hair sparkled in the sunlight, and his laughter echoed through the palace corridors. At that time, the people waiting in bread lines outside bakeries in Paris streets had no idea about the little prince's luxurious life. But history has never been merciful when it comes to protecting innocence. The world that Louis Charles knew, filled with silk curtains and golden toys, was about to crumble around him in ways that would make the most hardened soldiers weep. When the Bastille fell in 1789, little Louis Charles was only 4 years old. He didn't understand the panic that engulfed the palace. Why was his mother constantly crying? Why was his father pacing anxiously in his chambers? There was no safe place left for the royal family. The very foundations of their world were shifting beneath their feet like quicksand, and they were all sinking slowly into an abyss from which there would be no escape. On October 6, 1789, when the women of Paris marched on Versailles, the little prince watched the crowd from his window. He held his toy soldiers in his hands and asked his mother, "Mother, why are these people so angry?" Marie Antoinette didn't know how to answer her son's innocent questions. How could she explain to her 4-year-old child why people hated them so much? How could she make him understand that his very existence had become a symbol of everything the people despised about their lives? The crowds that surrounded the palace that day weren't just angry, they were desperate. These were people who had watched their children starve while the royal family lived in unimaginable luxury. They were mothers who had buried babies because they couldn't afford medicine, fathers who had worked themselves to death in fields they would never own, children who had never tasted meat or seen the inside of school. When they looked up at the palace windows and saw the little prince in his silk clothes, they didn't see an innocent child. They saw the embodiment of a system that had crushed their spirits and stolen their hope. When the royal family was forced to move to Paris, little Louis Charles's life changed completely. He could no longer run in vast gardens or play freely. They lived like prisoners in the Tuileries Palace, watched constantly by guards who made no effort to hide their contempt. The child who had once been surrounded by dozens of servants eager to fulfill his every wish now found himself in rooms where the very air seemed thick with hatred and resentment. King Louis XVI spent his final days with his son, trying to teach him reading and writing. In the evenings, they would read books together, and the little prince would fall asleep on his father's lap. The king was extremely pessimistic about his son's future, but he hid this from the child. According to the memoirs of family friend Madame Royale, Louis XVI once took his son into his arms one night and said, "My son, you will be the king of this country." But remember, a king must love his people more than himself. 7-year-old Louis Charles couldn't understand his father's words. He only saw that his father was sad and his mother cried constantly, and he was increasingly frightened by the deteriorating situation around them. The palace, once filled with music and laughter, now echoed with whispered conversations and fearful glances. Servants who had once smiled at him now looked away when he approached, and those who remained loyal seemed to age years in the span of days. The child began having nightmares. He would wake screaming in the middle of the night, calling for his nurse, but she was no longer there. The familiar faces that had surrounded him since birth were disappearing one by one, replaced by stern revolutionary guards who looked at him not as a child, but as a symbol of everything they were fighting to destroy. His toys were taken away, deemed too extravagant for the new order. His beautiful clothes were replaced with simple garments that served as a daily reminder of his family's fallen status. When Louis XVI head was cut off in the guillotine on January 21, 1793, 8-year-old Louis Charles suddenly became France's king, Louis XVII. Of course, the revolutionaries didn't recognize this title. For them, he was just Capet's son, stripped of all royal dignity, and reduced to nothing more than a political prisoner whose very existence threatened their vision of a new France. After his father's execution, Marie Antoinette completely collapsed. She was doing everything she could to protect her son, but it was impossible. In their rooms in the Temple Tower, she never left her son's side day or night, holding him tightly against her chest as if she could somehow shield him from the horrors that awaited them both. Little Louis Charles couldn't fully grasp that his father was dead. He constantly asked, "When will my father come?" Every time Marie Antoinette heard this question, her heart broke a little more. The queen's final months were spent in moments with her son. She sang songs to him, combed his hair, and told him stories. Among the cold walls of the Temple Tower, they tried to live small moments that would remind them of the old beautiful days. But even these simple acts of maternal love were viewed with suspicion by their captors, who saw any display of royal dignity as a threat to the revolutionary cause. Marie Antoinette constantly repeated to her son, "You are a Prince Louis Charles. Never forget this. Whatever happens, never lose your honor." But the revolutionaries were uncomfortable with the queen being so close to her son. They didn't want the child to be influenced by his mother or learn royal values. For this reason, they made a terrible decision that would haunt the pages of history forever. On July 3, 1793, they decided to separate Marie Antoinette from her son. The screams coming from the tower that morning froze even the guards' blood. The sound that echoed through those stone corridors wasn't just the cry of a mother losing her child. It was the sound of humanity itself being torn apart at its most fundamental level. "No, you cannot take my son from me." Marie Antoinette's screams echoed off the tower walls. Little Louis Charles clung to his mother's skirts, pleading through tears, "Mother, don't leave me." The representatives of the Revolutionary Council forcibly pulled the 8-year-old child from his mother's arms. Marie Antoinette collapsed to the ground, her outstretched hands grasping at emptiness as her son was dragged away. This moment of separation was perhaps one of the most merciless scenes in the French Revolution. A mother and son were saying goodbye, without knowing they would never see each other again. The child's screams echoed through the corridors long after he had been taken away, and Marie Antoinette's sobs could be heard throughout the tower for days afterward. Little Louis Charles was taken to the lower floors of the tower. He was no longer in his mother's protective arms. He had only fallen into the hands of revolutionaries who wanted to re-educate him. The room they placed him in was barely large enough for a bed and a small table. The walls were damp with moisture that seeped through the ancient stones, and the only light came from a small barred window that showed nothing but a patch of gray sky. The child spent his first night alone, crying for his mother. He pressed himself against the door, hoping to hear her voice, but there was only silence. The guards outside his door could hear his muffled sobs, but they had been ordered to show no mercy. This was just the beginning of a systematic program designed to destroy everything the child had ever known about himself and his place in the world. Antoine Simon and his wife Jean-Marie were an elderly shoemaker couple. The Revolutionary Committee had assigned them to care for the little prince. But their purpose wasn't to take care of a child, it was to completely transform him. The committee's task was clear: turn the royal child into a simple citizen, make him forget aristocratic values, and if possible, turn him into a revolutionary. This education process was carried out through horrific methods. They taught little Louis Charles profane songs and forced him to insult his mother and father. If he resisted, he was beaten. The couple had been chosen specifically for their hatred of the aristocracy and their willingness to use any means necessary to break the child's spirit. The 8-year-old child initially tried to resist. "I am a prince, my mother is the queen," he would shout. But every act of resistance was met with new punishment. He was left without food, locked alone in the cold basement. The Simons would wake him in the middle of the night to make him recite revolutionary slogans, and when he refused or made mistakes, they would force him to stand in the cold for hours until he collapsed from exhaustion. They cut off his beautiful golden hair, not neatly but roughly, leaving him with patches of stubble that made him look like a convict. They dressed him in coarse, dirty clothes that scratched his skin and reminded him constantly of his degraded status. The silk sheets and soft pillows of his childhood were replaced with a straw mattress that was rarely changed and blankets that provided little warmth against the perpetual chill of the stone tower. As months passed, little Louis Charles's spirit began to break. He no longer mentioned his mother or said he was a prince. The Simon couple called him Little Capet as if he were their own child, stripping away even his name as part of their systematic destruction of his identity. The transformation they were attempting wasn't just political, it was psychological warfare waged against a child's mind and soul. The child was forced to drink alcohol, which burned his throat and made him sick, but the Simons insisted it would make him strong, like a real man of the people. They taught him inappropriate songs filled with crude language and forced him to sing them while they laughed at his discomfort. Most horrible of all, he was forced to make false accusations against his mother. 8-year-old Louis Charles was compelled to testify against his mother in revolutionary courts, repeating lies he had been taught under threat of severe punishment. During Marie Antoinette's trial, the words her son said about her delivered the final blow to the Queen's heart. The child was repeating the lies he had been forced to learn, but to those who heard them, they sounded like the testimony of a son against his mother. The revolutionaries presented this as proof that even the Queen's own child had turned against her, not mentioning the months of torture and brainwashing that had produced these words. When Marie Antoinette was executed in the guillotine on October 16, 1793, her last words were about her son. "God, protect my son. Forgive him because he doesn't know what he's doing." The irony was cruel and complete. The child she had tried so desperately to protect had been forced to contribute to her destruction, and now she was asking God to forgive him for something he had been compelled to do against his will. The Simon couple gave Louis Charles the news of his mother's death. The child's reaction shocked everyone. He appeared to feel nothing. He just nodded his head and continued playing with his toys as if nothing had happened. In reality, the 8-year-old child couldn't fully grasp that his mother was dead. Having been subjected to mental torture for months, he was struggling to give emotional responses. But at night, little Louis Charles wept silently. He searched for his mother, whispering that he wanted to hug her. When the Simon couple noticed these moments, they punished the child more severely. They told him that tears were a sign of weakness, that real revolutionaries didn't cry for dead tyrants. They forced him to say that he was glad his mother was dead, that she had been an enemy of the people who deserved her fate. The psychological damage being inflicted on the child was beyond anything that could be repaired. He was being forced to celebrate the death of the person he loved most in the world, to deny his own grief, and to participate in the destruction of his own emotional capacity. The Simons were not just changing his political beliefs, they were attempting to destroy his ability to love, to grieve, and to maintain any connection to his own humanity. By 1794, Robespierre's terror regime was coming to an end. Many people who had shown extremism in the revolution had now fallen out of favor. The Simon couple was also affected by this situation and had to withdraw from the little prince's care. This transition period became a new trauma for Louis Charles. The faces he had gotten used to for months, despite their bad behavior, had seemed familiar. Now he was once again facing an unknown situation. Louis Charles, who was turning 9, was now experiencing serious health problems. Due to malnutrition, constant fear, and stress, his physical development had stopped. Officials reported that everyone who saw him was shocked. The child who had once been the picture of royal health and vitality was now a shadow of his former self, his body bearing the marks of systematic abuse and neglect. After the Simon couple, Etienne Laurent, who took over Louis Charles's care, tried to treat him more humanely than before. But it was too late. The child no longer trusted anyone. According to Laurent's reports, Louis Charles didn't speak at all during the day. He only answered questions by nodding his head. He didn't make a sound even while eating, and he suffered from insomnia throughout the night. The most disturbing detail was that the child had forgotten how to laugh. A 9-year-old child never laughing was an indication of how deep a trauma he had experienced. When Laurent tried to engage him with toys or games, the child would simply stare at them with empty eyes, as if he couldn't remember what play meant or why anyone would want to do such a thing. Laurent struggled to improve the little prince's condition. He brought him books and bought him toys. But Louis Charles showed no interest in them. It was as if his soul had left his body, leaving behind only an empty shell that went through the motions of living without any real engagement with the world around him. At the beginning of 1795, Louis Charles began to become seriously ill. He was constantly coughing, his fever was rising. He had weakened due to nutritional difficulties. The damp and cold conditions of the Temple Tower had completely ruined the child's health. When Dr. Pelletan examined the child, he understood that the situation was critical. But what surprised the doctor most were the torture marks on Louis Charles's body. Wounds opened by chains, marks of beatings, physical deformations caused by malnutrition. Seeing so many marks on the body of a 9-year-old child deeply shook the doctor. In his diary, Dr. Pelletan had written, "What has been done to this child violates the most basic rules of being human. A 9-year-old prince has been subjected to treatment that even the most merciless criminals wouldn't see." The doctor's examination revealed the full extent of the systematic abuse that had been inflicted on the child. There were scars from shackles around his wrists and ankles, evidence that he had been chained like an animal. His body showed signs of repeated beatings, malnutrition so severe that his growth had been permanently stunted, and psychological trauma so deep that he seemed to exist in a constant state of terror, even when no immediate threat was present. Louis Charles's final days were spent in pain. He couldn't speak or walk. His body had become extremely weak, and he was in constant pain. Some pro-revolution newspapers wrote that the little tyrant was about to die, and that this was the people's victory. But even the tower guards were saddened by the child's condition. They had watched this transformation from a healthy, innocent child into a broken shadow of humanity, and it had affected even these hardened men who had seen much violence in their revolutionary careers. In his final days, Louis Charles constantly searched for his mother. He whispered, "Where is my mother?" and said he was looking for her scent. These moments brought tears even to the guard's eyes. The child who had been forced to testify against his mother, who had been made to celebrate her death, was now calling for her with his dying breath. On the evening of June 8, 1795, little Louis Charles breathed his last breath. He hadn't even turned 10 years old. When he died, none of his family members were by his side. Only Laurent and a doctor were present. The child who should have been king of France died alone in a cold stone room, surrounded by strangers who had been his captors for most of his short life. Louis Charles's death deeply shook European monarchies. The killing of France's last legitimate king, in this way, had frightened all royal families. They saw in his fate a preview of what might await their own children if revolutionary fervor ever reached their borders. The autopsy report revealed horrific details. The trauma marks on the child's body were the result of a systematic torture program. Physical and psychological violence had killed a 10-year-old child. But the most tragic detail was the small notes the child had written in his final days. Although he knew how to read and write, he could only write the word mother. His longing for his mother had continued until his death. Found among his few possessions were crude drawings of a woman with a crown, always with tears on her face, always reaching out her arms as if trying to embrace someone who wasn't there. Today's historians view Louis Charles's story as one of the darkest pages of the French Revolution. The oppression inflicted on an innocent child in the name of revolutionary ideals is considered the most basic violation of human rights. The child's suffering has become a symbol of how political extremism can corrupt even the noblest intentions and turn human beings into monsters capable of torturing children. Marie Antoinette's last words had come true, "Protect my son." But no one had been able to protect little Louis Charles. Neither revolutionaries nor monarchists nor ordinary citizens had intervened to save a child from systematic abuse and murder. The boy who died in that cold room of the Temple Tower wasn't just a child. The face of the French Revolution that contradicted human values was embodied in a child's tragedy. This story shows us that no matter how noble political ideals may be, they can never justify wasting innocent people's lives. The suffering that 10-year-old Louis Charles endured is not acceptable for any political cause. His death stands as a permanent reminder that when we abandon our humanity in pursuit of political goals, we become the very monsters we claim to be fighting against. Could Marie Antoinette's soul find peace? Perhaps only when she was reunited with her son in heaven. Because in this world, the mother's last wish could not be fulfilled. The little prince could not be protected and became the victim of one of history's most merciless pages. In the end, the French Revolution, which had promised liberty, equality, and fraternity for all, had denied all three to a child whose only crime was being born into the wrong family at the wrong time.